"Still alone, Margaret?" My sister's laugh echoed across my mother's dining room before anyone had a chance to answer. Every fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth, and even the old ceiling fan, clicking overhead, seemed louder than it had a moment before. I looked at Linda for a long second, then quietly reached for my glass of sweet tea. I didn't answer immediately, and the silence seemed to bother her more than any words could have. 3 years earlier, she had walked away with my husband, Daniel, and she wore that victory like a Sunday hat. Daniel sat beside her, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. He stirred the same cup of coffee over and over without taking a single sip. I'd been married to him for 28 years, long enough to recognize every nervous habit he had, and something about him didn't sit right. "I'm doing just fine," I finally said. Linda smirked, clearly disappointed that I hadn't broken down in front of everyone. She always believed the loudest person controlled the room. I'd learned long ago that the quietest person usually noticed the most. Outside, pickup trucks lined the gravel driveway, while brisket smoke drifted through the open kitchen window. Children chased one another beneath the old oak tree. Cousins carried homemade pies through the screen door, and crickets had already begun singing in the distance. To everyone else, it looked like another peaceful family reunion after Sunday church. To me, it felt like I was sitting in a courtroom waiting for someone to speak the truth. For 3 years, I'd listened while Linda told anyone willing to hear that Daniel had simply fallen out of love with me, and that their relationship hadn't started until after our divorce. Some relatives believed her. Others chose to stay silent. I never argued with any of them because I wasn't born yesterday. Instead, I quietly hired an attorney and spent months collecting every bank statement, canceled check, tax return, insurance record, and property document I could find. My lawyer looked at those boxes of paperwork and told me, "People change their stories. Paper doesn't." I didn't fully understand what he meant until 2 mornings, before that family reunion, when I opened my mailbox and found a certified envelope waiting for me. I hadn't shown it to a single person, and after hearing Linda laugh at me across my mother's table, I realized that whatever was inside that envelope was about to change far more than my own life. I kept smiling, even after Linda turned her attention to someone else. She thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. I simply wasn't in a hurry. I've seen enough in my life to know that truth doesn't need to interrupt people. It waits until they're finished talking. My mother began clearing the dishes, while my father carried a pitcher of sweet tea out to the back porch. One by one, the family drifted outside, settling into old lawn chairs beneath the shade of the oak tree. The smell of brisket filled the warm Tennessee air. Children laughed near the tire swing, and every now and then the screen door slapped shut behind another cousin. It looked like every reunion we'd ever had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this one would be remembered for years. Daniel stayed close to Linda, yet he seemed distracted. More than once, I caught him glancing toward the old mailbox beside the gravel road. It struck me as odd because he'd never cared about the mail when we were married. Linda noticed where he was looking and quietly nudged his arm. He forced another smile, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Folks notice more than people think, and I noticed the worry on his face growing heavier by the minute. My father eventually walked over and handed me a fresh glass of tea. "You doing all right?" he asked softly. "Better than I have been in a long time," I answered. He studied my face for a moment as though he wanted to ask another question, but he simply nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, my cousin Helen eased into the empty chair beside me. Helen wasn't the sort of woman who enjoyed gossip. She attended church every Sunday, volunteered at the community pantry, and believed people should mind their own business, unless the truth mattered. She leaned close enough that no one else could hear. "Margaret," she whispered, "I've carried something on my heart for 3 years." I looked at her without saying a word. She took a slow breath before continuing. "The story Linda told this family, it never sat right with me." I felt my hands tighten around my glass. Helen reached into the cloth handbag, resting on her lap, and carefully removed a worn white envelope. "I should have given this to you years ago," she said quietly. "I was afraid of breaking your heart." She placed it in my hands. When I turned it over, I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. My heart didn't race. It simply became very still as I slowly opened the envelope and unfolded the first page. My hand stayed steady as I unfolded the letter. I recognized Daniel's handwriting before I read the first sentence. 28 years of marriage will do that. The paper had yellowed around the edges, as though it had been tucked away for a long time. Helen watched my face without saying a word. I read slowly. Daniel hadn't written the letter to me. He had written it to Linda. In it, he thanked her for being patient and promised that once everything is settled, we'll finally have the life we deserve. At the bottom was a date. I looked at it twice to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The letter had been written almost 8 months before. Daniel ever asked me for a divorce. I quietly folded it and slipped it back into the envelope. Helen sighed. I found it blowing across the parking lot behind Miller's Diner that spring. I recognized Daniel's handwriting from the church donation envelopes. I thought about giving it to you 100 times, but I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. When I heard Linda laughing at you today, I realized keeping quiet wasn't helping anyone. I thanked her, and she gently squeezed my hand. "Bless your heart," she whispered. "You deserved the truth a long time ago." I wasn't angry. Strangely enough, I felt lighter. For 3 years, I'd wondered whether I had imagined the warning signs. That letter answered a question I'd carried far too long. Still, something bothered me. If Daniel had been planning to leave months earlier, why had he emptied our savings account only days before filing for divorce? The timing didn't make sense. Just then, my attorney, Mr. Collins, stepped through the gate carrying his worn leather briefcase. He wasn't invited to family reunions, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who stopped by without a reason. He nodded politely to my parents before walking straight toward me. "Margaret," he said in a calm voice, "I'm sorry to interrupt your afternoon, but the bank called my office an hour ago." My stomach tightened for the first time that day. He opened his briefcase, removed a thin folder, and looked directly at me. "The records we requested finally arrived." I glanced at Daniel. The color drained from his face the moment he saw that folder. Before I could ask a single question, Mr. Collins quietly added, "The letter explains why your marriage ended. These records explain why someone may have committed fraud." Suddenly, the laughter from just a few minutes earlier felt like it had happened in another lifetime. Nobody on that porch said a word after Mr. Collins spoke. Even the children playing in the yard seemed quieter, as if the whole afternoon had paused. My attorney laid the folder on the patio table without opening it. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off it. Linda crossed her arms and forced a smile, but it looked more nervous than confident. I'd known my sister all my life. She only smiled like that when she was afraid someone else knew the truth. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and looked around the porch. "I don't usually discuss legal matters outside my office," he said calmly, "but Margaret has every right to hear this as soon as possible." My father nodded. "Go ahead," he replied. "We've heard enough stories. I'd rather hear the facts." Mr. Collins opened the folder and removed several certified bank records. 3 years ago, he began, Daniel reported, that the money withdrawn from the joint savings account had been used to pay business obligations before the divorce. He placed one document on the table. According to the bank's records, that statement was false. Daniel lowered his head. Mr. Collins continued, "The funds were transferred through a cashier's check into a newly opened account." He turned another page, toward my father. The account holder was Linda. The porch fell silent. Linda immediately shook her head. "That's not what happened." Mr. Collins didn't argue. He simply slid another document across the table. "This is the account application bearing your signature. The bank has already verified it." Linda looked at the papers but never touched them. Daniel finally spoke. "I told her to open the account." Those 6 words changed everything. He wasn't trying to protect himself anymore. He was trying to protect her. My mother slowly sat down, staring at Daniel as though she no longer recognized the man she'd welcomed into our family for nearly 3 decades. "So the 2 of you planned this?" she asked quietly. Neither of them answered. They didn't have to. The documents answered for them. Mr. Collins closed the folder and looked at me. "The court has already scheduled a hearing to reopen the financial portion of your divorce." I took a slow breath. For 3 years, I'd carried questions that no one could answer. Now every answer was sitting on that table in black ink. But before anyone could stand, Mr. Collins reached into his briefcase one last time. "There is one more document," he said. "It wasn't filed by the bank. It was filed by someone who has finally decided to tell the court the entire truth." Daniel closed his eyes before the name was even spoken. Daniel never opened his eyes. He didn't have to. Somewhere deep down, he already knew the truth had finally caught up with him. Mr. Collins removed the last document from his briefcase and laid it carefully on the table. "This is a sworn affidavit," he said. "It was signed yesterday by someone who worked at the bank 3 years ago." Every face on the porch turned toward him. The employee remembered processing the cashier's check because Daniel specifically asked that the transaction be completed as quickly and as quietly as possible. When the subpoena arrived, she reviewed the archived records and realized the account receiving the money belonged to Linda. My father slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "So Margaret wasn't imagining any of it," he said. "No," Mr. Collins replied. "She wasn't." Linda finally looked at me. The confidence she had carried into my parents' home was gone. She opened her mouth as though she wanted to apologize, but no words came out. After a long silence, Daniel stood. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. 3 years earlier, I had wanted nothing more than to hear those words. Standing there on my parents' porch, they didn't mean much anymore." "An apology doesn't change what happened," I answered calmly. "But the truth finally does." No one argued. No one shouted. There was nothing left to defend. Over the next several months, the court reopened the financial portion of our divorce. The judge reviewed every bank record, every statement, every canceled check, and every piece of evidence my attorney had carefully preserved. Daniel was ordered to repay the money he had hidden from our joint account, along with my legal expenses. The decision wasn't based on sympathy. It was based on documents, sworn testimony, and the law. I used the settlement to pay off the mortgage on my little house and replace the old porch swing where I spent most evenings, watching the sunset. Life didn't become perfect, but it became peaceful. Linda and Daniel stayed married, yet family gatherings were never the same. No one insulted them or pushed them away. People simply stopped believing everything they said. Trust, once broken, rarely finds its way home again. Months later, I saw Linda after Sunday church. She lowered her eyes as we passed each other without speaking. I wished her no harm. I simply kept walking. As I sat on my porch that evening, listening to the crickets and watching the last light disappear behind the Tennessee hills, I realized something that has stayed with me ever since. The truth may arrive quietly, but when it finally does, it never needs anyone to raise their voice.